Hello everyone, friends. Do you know where the most fascinating hidden stories actually lie? Not in the loud battles that fill the history books. They are concealed in silence, in abandoned laboratories, in remote villages, and in the minds of solitary geniuses. Today, we will talk about such individuals. Those who witnessed things that simply could not exist, created devices that were not supposed to work, and managed to survive where death seemed like the only way out. So get ready, it's going to be very interesting. And, as is our tradition, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and comment about which city you are from. It greatly helps our channel grow. Let's begin. Story number 1. The year when summer was stolen. The year is 1816. In Europe, it was dubbed the Year of the Poor, and in America, the year without summer. Summer simply did not arrive. In June, it snowed in New York City. In July, rivers in Pennsylvania froze. In August, icy rains fell in France, destroying the grape harvest. The sky above the world was a strange yellowish-brown color, and the sun looked like a pale, sick disk. People were terrified. They believed the end of the world had come. Priests spoke of divine retribution. Scientists proposed insane theories about sunspots. Famine began. A typhus epidemic broke out in Ireland. Farmers in Switzerland ate cats and rats. No one understood what was happening. The cause of the global cooling was not in the heavens or in human sins. It was located 12,000 kilometers away from Europe, on a tiny Indonesian island named Sumbawa. A year earlier, in April 1815, the Tambora volcano erupted there. This was the most powerful eruption in human history. The sound of the explosion could be heard 2,500 kilometers away. The volcano ejected 150 cubic kilometers of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere. That is enough to cover all of Great Britain with a layer of ash 60 centimeters thick. This ash veil enveloped the entire planet. It reflected sunlight, preventing it from warming the Earth. The global temperature dropped by 3 degrees. It may not seem like much, but it was enough to cripple the planet's climate machine. This summer that never was not only spawned famine, but also great creations. In Switzerland, on the shores of Lake Geneva, a group of young Englishmen, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and his wife Mary, sat in a house unable to go outside due to relentless rain. Byron suggested, "Let's each write a scary story." That night, Mary Shelley conceived of Frankenstein. In Germany, due to the death of horses, oats did not grow, and there was nothing to feed them. Inventor Carl Dreis created a walking machine, the prototype of the bicycle. One volcano on a forgotten island changed the climate, caused famine, and gifted the world with a monster and a bicycle. The world didn't even know the name of its tormentor. Only 100 years later did scientists link the year without summer to the eruption of Tambora, proving how fragile our civilization is against the breath of the earth. The volcano shrouded the planet in ash, bringing hunger and despair. But sometimes, darkness does not come from the sky, but from the hearts of people. And then a hero is needed to voluntarily step into this man-made darkness to shed light upon it. Our next hero was a journalist who witnessed hell on earth, revealed the truth about it, and was killed for doing so. This is story number 2. A man who saw hunger, yet no one believed him. Moscow, 1933. The capital of the Soviet Union was alive with the feverish rhythm of building a new world. Foreign journalists seated in the bar of the Metropole Hotel drank vodka, listened to jazz, and wrote articles about the great achievements of the 5-year plan. Officially, enthusiasm reigned in the country, but whispers of horror echoed in the corners. There were talks of people somewhere out there in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, eating tree bark, while entire villages died in absolute silence. Into this, Moscow came a young Welsh journalist, Garrett Jones. He was ambitious and naive. He had just interviewed Hitler and believed that journalism could change the world. He wanted to see everything with his own eyes. Breaking all prohibitions, Jones bought a train ticket and secretly disembarked at a small station in Ukraine. He walked through snow-covered fields. What he saw shattered him. This was not hunger caused by drought. This was a man-made, orchestrated hell. Empty villages where no smoke rose from the corpses, people with swollen faces from hunger, resembling ghosts. He saw children with distended bellies and eyes that were old and empty. He spent several days in this hell, sharing his bread with the peasants until his supplies ran out. He returned to Moscow a changed man. He took a train to Berlin, and at the very first press conference told the truth. He screamed about millions dying, about the Soviet government taking the last grain from the peasants to sell it to the West and buy machinery. The world was supposed to shudder, but instead, the world decided that Garrett Jones was a liar. His main critic was Walter Duranty, the head of the Moscow bureau of the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize winner and the most influential journalist of that time. Sitting in his cozy Moscow office, Duranty wrote a rebuttal article. "There is no famine," he asserted. "There is only malnutrition in some areas caused by poor harvests." Western intellectuals and politicians, charmed by the communist experiment, believed Duranty instead of some young upstart from Wales. Jones was blacklisted. His career was destroyed. Friends turned away from him. He became an outcast for daring to tell the inconvenient truth. Only many years later, after the archives were opened, did the world acknowledge that the Holodomor existed and that it claimed millions of lives. Garrett Jones was right, but he did not live to see that day. 2 years later, in 1935, he was killed under mysterious circumstances in Mongolia. He was only 30 years old. Jones paid for the truth with his life, but sometimes the truth can destroy not a person, but an entire scientific theory, burying it for decades. Our next story is about a humble monk who, while growing peas in the monastery garden, discovered the laws of life, yet the world was not ready to listen. This is story number 3. A legacy buried in the monastery garden. The Austrian Empire, 1856. In the quiet garden of the Augustinian monastery of St. Thomas in Blun, now Brno, work began that would change the world. But the world did not know about this. The worker himself, a humble monk named Gregor Mendel, did not know either. He was a teacher who had failed the biology teaching exam twice. He was considered kind, but not particularly capable. Every day for 8 years, Mendel would go to his garden. He was not just growing peas, he was conversing with them in a language that did not yet exist, the language of mathematics and statistics. His tools were simple: a camel hair brush, tweezers, and endless patience. He crossed plants with yellow peas and with green ones, plants with smooth seeds and with wrinkled ones. He manually pollinated 28,000 plants. Then he opened hundreds of thousands of pods and counted every pea. From the outside, it appeared as meditative madness, a monk obsessed with peas. But in his notebooks, filled with columns of numbers, Mendel saw what no one before him had seen. He saw laws. At that time, science believed that heredity worked like mixing paints. Offspring were just a blend of their parents. But Mendel saw something different. He saw that traits did not blend. They were passed on as separate, indivisible units. He recognized dominant and recessive traits. He understood that a child could resemble a grandfather instead of a father. And he explained why he essentially discovered genes without even knowing that word. In 1865, he presented the results of his 8 years of work to the local Society of Naturalists. 40 scholars politely listened to the monk's lecture about mathematical ratios and pea hybrids. They applauded but did not ask a single question. They understood not a word. For them, botanists used to describing leaf shapes, his numbers and formulas were gibberish. His work was published in the Society's proceedings. Mendel sent 40 copies of his report to leading scientists across Europe. No one responded. The greatest discovery in the history of biology was met with deafening silence. Mendel died in 1884 without ever receiving recognition. He was buried as the abbot of the monastery, not as the father of genetics. His scientific works gathered dust in libraries for 35 years. Only in 1900, when 3 scientists in 3 different countries independently rediscovered his laws, did they, to their astonishment, stumble upon the forgotten article of the monk from Brunn. They realized that the solitary genius had outpaced them by an entire generation, working in a garden with a pair of tweezers and a notebook. The world was not ready for Mendel's quiet revolution, buried beneath statistics. But our next story is about a revolution that was loud, bloody, and fiery, which the world, on the contrary, tried to forget and erase from textbooks as quickly as possible. We will travel to a city that was burned to the ground, not because of war, but because of hatred, and the truth about which only surfaced nearly 100 years later. Story number 4. A city erased from the map and from memory. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. In an era of brutal racial segregation, the Greenwood District was a marvel. It was called Black Wall Street. It was the most prosperous African-American community in the United States. There were its own banks, hospitals, movie theaters, and luxury hotels. Black doctors, lawyers, and businessmen created their own independent world of success. This infuriated many white residents of Tulsa, who saw the Greenwood District as a challenge to the established order. On May 30th, 19-year-old Dick Rowland, a black shoe shiner, entered an elevator in the Drexel building. The elevator operator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What happened inside that elevator is not exactly known. Sarah screamed. Dick ran out. A shopkeeper from a nearby store called the police. The next day, the Tulsa Tribune ran a screaming headline, "Black Man Attacks White Woman in Elevator." The rumor, as often happens, turned into a monster. The newspaper even published an article calling for the lynching of the black man. That evening, a crowd of white men, armed with guns and pitchforks, gathered outside the courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held, demanding that he be handed over to them. In response, a group of black World War I veterans arrived at the courthouse, also armed, to protect him. A stray shot rang out, and the city exploded. This was not just a fight, it was war. Thousands of white residents, incited by the authorities and members of the Ku Klux Klan, poured into Greenwood. They looted homes, stormed businesses, beat and killed everyone they encountered. The police did not just stand by. They handed out weapons to the white men and arrested black individuals attempting to defend themselves. The most terrifying events unfolded at night. Private planes appeared over Greenwood, dropping dynamite and incendiary bottles onto homes and businesses. Black Wall Street turned into a fiery hell. By the morning of May 31st, the once thriving district was reduced to smoldering ruins. 35 blocks were burned to the ground. Estimates suggest that between 100 and 300 people died. 10,000 were left homeless. But the worst was yet to come. The city decided to forget. Every record of the massacre was destroyed. Articles were cut from newspapers. Eyewitness testimonies were hidden away in archives. The authorities declared that it was simply a riot provoked by black individuals. The truth about the planes, the role of the police, the scale of the killings was buried for 75 years. This event was not included in textbooks. A whole generation grew up unaware that beneath their feet lay the ashes of a civil war. Only in 1997 was a commission established to investigate and restore the truth. The city of Tulsa officially apologized, but the scars remained. Tulsa had been consumed by the fire of hate. But our next story is about a man who, conversely, created a fire of love. He was a priest who, secretly and at the risk of his reputation and life, became a patron of lovers. And for this, he was beheaded. You know this man's name, but you don't know his true story. This is story number 5, the real story of Saint Valentine. The Roman Empire, 2nd century AD. Emperor Claudius II Gothicus, nicknamed the Cruel, faced a problem. Men were unwilling to join the army. Claudius decided that love was to blame. In his opinion, married soldiers were too attached to home and family. They made poor warriors. So, he issued a decree to forbid young men from marrying. For the lovers of Rome, this was a death sentence. But in the shadows of catacombs and small churches, there was a man who dared to challenge the emperor. His name was Valentine. He was a simple Christian priest, or possibly a bishop. The history here is a bit unclear. He believed that marriage is a sacred union, blessed by God, and no emperor has the right to annul it. Valentine began to secretly marry soldiers to their beloveds, By candlelight at night, risking capture, he united hearts that the law sought to separate. He became the patron of forbidden love. But secrets always come to light. Valentine was arrested and thrown into prison. Legend has it that while imprisoned, he fell in love with the blind daughter of his jailer. With the power of his faith, or perhaps his medical knowledge, he healed her, and the young woman regained her sight. Before his execution, he wrote her a farewell letter filled with tenderness. He signed it, Your Valentine. On February 14th, around the year 270, he was beheaded. His deed was not forgotten. 200 years later, Pope Gelasius I canonized him and declared February 14th as St. Valentine's Day. But he did this not only because of love. At this time, a pagan festival called Lupercalia was taking place, a wild, raucous fertility festival with sacrifices and erotic games. The church wanted to replace it with something more appropriate. The story of a martyred lover fitted perfectly. Thus, thanks to the bravery of one priest and the cunning of one pope, we have a day when we exchange heart-shaped cards. But behind this commercial facade lies the real story of a man who gave his life for the right of people to express their love at the altar. Valentine died for love, but the heroine of the next story, in contrast, survived thanks to hatred. Hatred for the man who left her to die in the desert. She trekked 250 kilometers through the Australian wilderness, driven only by a thirst for revenge. Her story became a national epic. Story number 6. The Woman Who Walked for Vengeance. Australia, 1977. Lillian Alling was a Russian émigré living in New York. She was unhappy. She longed for home, for the Siberian forest she had seen in her childhood, and she decided to return. But she had no money for a ticket, so she made a decision that seemed insane. She would walk. She crossed all of North America, reached Alaska, allegedly crossed the Bering Strait by boat, and found herself in Siberia. But the Soviet authorities arrested her as a spy and deported her. But Lillian did not give up. She decided to try again. In 1927, she reached Western Australia. There, she met a man named Jack Grix. He was a bushman, a hunter, a connoisseur of the wild. He promised to guide her through the desert to the northern coast. They set off on their journey, but soon Grix realized that Lillian was not going to pay him. He grew angry. One morning, in the heart of the Gibson Desert, he beat her, took her food, water, and compass, broke her rifle, and left her to die. It was a death sentence. For hundreds of kilometers around were scorching sand, poisonous snakes, and not a drop of water. But Grix underestimated the Russian woman. Lillian did not lie down to die. She was driven not by the desire to survive, but by the desire for revenge. I will find him and kill him, she decided. She followed his trail. She walked for 2 months, covering 250 kilometers. She ate wild berries that she learned to recognize by observing the birds. She learned to find water by digging up dry stream beds. She slept in caves. She killed snakes and lizards with stones and roasted them over fires she made by friction. The Aborigines she encountered were shocked. They saw a white woman walking alone where even they moved in groups. They named her the Ghost of the Desert. She reached civilization, a small settlement of cattle ranchers. Her story became a sensation. The police found Jack Griggs. He was tried, but not for attempted murder. It was hard to prove that. He was charged with theft instead. He received a short sentence. What happened to Lillian afterward is not exactly known. She vanished as mysteriously as she appeared. Perhaps she found a way to return to Russia. Her story became an Australian legend, a tribute to human endurance, fueled by the strongest fire in the universe, the thirst for justice. Lillian survived thanks to hatred, but the hero of the next story survived thanks to a cat. Not just any cat, but a ship's cat who survived 3 shipwrecks and became the mascot of the British Navy. His name was Unsinkable Sam. Story number 7. The Cat with 9 Lives and 3 Shipwrecks. World War II. The German battleship Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, set sail on its first and last mission. On board, amidst the roar of cannons and the bustle of sailors, lived a black and white cat named Oscar. In May 1941, the British Navy hunted the Bismarck. After a fierce battle, the battleship was sunk. Of the 2,200 crew members, just over 100 survived. When the British destroyer Cossack picked up survivors, the sailors saw something in the water clinging to a piece of wood. It was Oscar, wet, scared, but alive. He was brought aboard and became the Cossacks' mascot. For several months, Oscar served in the Royal Navy, catching mice and enjoying his rations. But in October of that same year, the Cossack, escorting convoys in the Mediterranean, was torpedoed by a German submarine. The explosion ripped off the bow of the destroyer. 159 people perished. The ship was on fire but did not sink. The crew transferred to another ship, but Oscar remained on the tilting, smoking wreck. When it became clear that the Cossack could not be saved, the British sent a rescue boat for the cat. They found him on the deck, calm as always. Oscar was taken to a base in Gibraltar and renamed. He was now called Unsinkable Sam. His third and final ship was the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the legendary ship that had participated in the hunt for the Bismarck. The sailors believed that the cat, a mascot who had survived 2 disasters, would bring them luck. In November 1941, just a month after the sinking of the Cossack, the Ark Royal, returning from Malta, was torpedoed by the same German submarine U-81. The aircraft carrier suffered a massive breach and began to list slowly. The captain tried to bring it to Gibraltar, but in vain. The order was given to abandon ship. The rescue boat, picking people from the water, came across a board on which the cat was sitting. He was angry, but completely harmless. After the third shipwreck, the Admiralty decided enough was enough. The Unsinkable Sam was decommissioned and placed on shore. He was appointed the chief mouse-catcher at the residence of the Governor-General of Gibraltar and then sent into honorable retirement at the Sailors' Home in Belfast. He passed away in 1955. His pastel portrait hangs in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Cat Sam survived 3 wars at sea, but the hero of the next story survived a war that raged inside him. He was a man with 2 brains, and they were constantly fighting each other, causing his hands to live their own lives. Story number 8. War in One Head. Imagine that your left hand is your worst enemy. You try to button your shirt with your right hand, while your left hand is unbuttoning it. You want to hug your wife, but your left hand strikes her in the face. You cannot control it. The hand lives its own life, obeying someone else's will. But that will is yours as well. This is not a horror movie plot. This is a real condition known as alien hand syndrome. One of the most famous patients who suffered from it was Karen Byrne. In the 1970s, Karen suffered from severe epilepsy. To save her, doctors performed a radical operation called a commissurotomy. They cut the corpus callosum, a bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain. The surgery helped with her seizures, but created a new monster. Her brain split into 2 independent personalities, trapped in one skull. The left hemisphere, responsible for speech, logic, and the right side of the body, remained old Karen, while the right, responsible for emotions, images, and the left side, became a rebel. Chaos ensued. Her left hand turned off the television that the right side was watching. It took cigarettes away from the right and extinguished them. When Karen tried to make a phone call, her left hand would hang up the phone. One time, after arguing with her mother, Karen attempted to hit her with her right hand, but her left hand grabbed her right and wouldn't let her do it. Her own hand protected her from herself. Scientists studying Karen were thrilled. They could talk to each hemisphere separately. If they showed an image in the right visual field, the information went to the left, the speaking hemisphere, and Karen could say what she saw. If the image was shown in the left visual field, the information went to the right, the non-speaking hemisphere, and Karen would say, "I see nothing." But her left hand could draw the object. This was direct evidence that 2 different consciousnesses live in our heads. Karen Byrne lived the rest of her life trying to reconcile the 2 enemies within herself. She learned to control her alien hand by giving it tasks. She became a living laboratory that helped us understand that our identity is not a monolith, but a fragile union of two different worlds. Moskayem was divided by a scalpel, but the hero of the next story divided his life himself, voluntarily locking himself in a cave for 200 days in complete darkness to understand how time works, and when he emerged, he thought only 100 days had passed. Story number 9. The Man Who Lost Time. French speleologist Michel Sifour was obsessed with caves and time since childhood. He was tormented by the question, what is time? Is it an objective reality, or merely a habit imposed upon us by the sun and clocks? In 1962, at the age of 23, he decided to conduct a radical experiment. He descended into the Strassen cave in the French Alps without a watch, without a calendar, without sunlight, in complete isolation. His goal was to spend 2 months there, relying solely on his internal biological clock. On the surface was one of his assistants. Michel was to call them on a field phone every time he woke up, ate, and went to sleep so they could record his cycles. He had no idea what time it was. The first few days were torture. The cold, the temperature in the cave was about 0, 100% humidity, eternal night. The only sound was the dripping water and the beating of his own heart. But then his body began to adapt. He found that his internal day was not 24 hours, but 24 seconds, as he went to sleep and woke up a little later each day. Time stretched for him. He could stay awake for 36 hours straight, then sleep for 12. He read, explored the cave, and conducted tests, for example, trying to count to 120 with the rhythm of 1 second to check how his internal metronome was working. He lost track of the days. When the assistants called him and said, "Michel, it is time to come out, the experiment is over," he was in shock. "Already?" he asked. "But only 35 days have passed." "Michel," they responded, 58 days have passed. Today is September 17th. He had lost almost a month. When he was pulled to the surface, he was blinded by the light. His first steps on the grass were uncertain, like an infant's, but his experiment proved the existence of internal clocks in humans long before it became mainstream in science. Michel Sifour conducted several similar experiments, including a 6-month stay in a cave in Texas. He sacrificed years of his life to understand the nature of time and prove that it flows differently when the sun is not watching you. Michel lived in darkness to understand light, but the heroine of the next story, on the contrary, brought light to the darkest corners of the world. She was a journalist who pretended to be insane to expose the horrors of a mental hospital, and her report changed America. Story number 10. 10 Days in the House of the Insane, New York, 1887. Nellie Bly, the pseudonym of Elizabeth Cochran, was a young and bold journalist. She came to the offices of the New York World, Joseph Pulitzer's newspaper, and proposed a crazy idea. "I will pretend to be insane," she said, "and get into the women's mental hospital on Blackwell Island. I will write about what really happens there." The editor, astonished by her bravery, agreed. Nellie began to prepare. She practiced in front of the mirror, portraying a mad look. She stopped bathing, wore an old dress, and rented a room in a cheap boarding house. There she began to act strangely, screamed at night, refused to sleep, and insisted that everyone around her was insane. The boarding house owner called the police. Nellie was brought to court. The judge, observing her lost demeanor, delivered the verdict without hesitation. Poor thing, clearly unfit to send to Blackwell Island. The plan worked. As soon as the doors of the asylum closed behind Nellie, she stopped pretending. She began to behave completely normally, but it was too late. The doctors and nurses saw no difference. The more sensible she seemed, the more insane they believed her to be. Her calmness was perceived as cunning, and her questions as paranoia. What she witnessed inside was hell. The patients were fed rotten meat and stale bread. They were forced to sit for hours on hard benches in unheated rooms, not allowed to move or speak. They were bathed in icy water, with buckets poured over their heads, with no water changed after other patients. The nurses were cruel. They beat the women, suffocated them, bound them with ropes. Many patients were not insane, but simply poor immigrants who didn't speak English, or women abandoned by their husbands. Nellie spent 10 days in this hell. She saw healthy people go mad from terror and despair. On the 10th day, as agreed, a reporter from the newspaper arrived at the hospital and demanded her release. 2 days later, an article about her appeared in the New York World. 10 days in a mental institution. It was a sensation. The public was in shock. An investigation was launched. The city allocated an additional $1 million to improve conditions in psychiatric hospitals. The cruel nurses were fired. New regulations for examinations and patient care were introduced. Nellie Bly became a star. She didn't just write a sensational story. She changed the system, becoming the voice of those who had lost theirs. Nellie pretended to be sick to help the healthy. But the hero of the next story was completely healthy, yet he was declared ill and locked away in a leper colony, where he lived in solitude for 30 years, waiting for a wife who never came. Story number 11. The Curse of the Healthy Man. Hawaii, the island of Molokai, the early 20th century. It was a place of exile, the island of the lepers. People diagnosed with leprosy, Hansen's disease, were forcibly brought here from all over America. They were torn from their families, stripped of their names, given numbers, and left to die in the Kalaupapa colony, cut off from the world by the ocean and impenetrable cliffs. John Ely was a young Hawaiian. He was married to a beautiful woman named Olivia. They loved each other. But one day, strange spots appeared on Olivia's skin. The doctors diagnosed leprosy. She was taken to Molokai. John was heartbroken. He could not live without his wife, and he made a decision that seemed unimaginable. He voluntarily followed her there. He boarded a ship heading to hell and disembarked on the shores of Kalaupapa. He told the authorities that he was ill too. He found Olivia. They lived together in a small shack in the shade of palm trees. John cared for her, treated her sores, and fed her. He was the only healthy person in this realm of pain and despair. He saw how the disease slowly consumed his beloved, but he was there for her. Years passed, and Olivia died. John wanted to return. He was healthy. He underwent dozens of examinations. Doctors confirmed he did not have leprosy, but the bureaucracy was relentless. The law stated, anyone who enters the colony can never leave out of fear of infection. John Elia, a healthy man, became a lifelong prisoner on the island of the dead. He lived in Kalupa for 30 years. He became a gardener, growing flowers. He tended to the graves. He watched his friends die. He saw the world change somewhere out there, beyond the cliffs. He wrote letters asking for freedom. It was not until 1937, when he was already an old man, that he was finally allowed to leave. But it was too late. He could never adapt to his new life. He died a few years later, lonely and forgotten. His story is a tragedy of love that proved stronger than the fear of death and the cruelty of a system that overpowered common sense. John was locked away on the island, but the hero of the next story was locked within a painting. He was a forger who created a masterpiece, deceived the Nazis, became a national hero, and then, when he was put on trial, painted another masterpiece right in the courtroom to prove his innocence. This is story number 12, the forger who became a national hero. Han van Meegeren was a talented yet unrecognized Dutch artist. Critics deemed his style outdated. In retaliation, he decided to prove he was more genius than anyone. He resolved to forge Vermeer. He spent 6 years studying the technique of the great master. He found 15th century canvases, made paints from ancient pigments, using lapis lazuli and oil. He blended them with bakelite, an early form of plastic, so his painting would appear old after baking in an oven. In 1937, he unveiled Christ at Emmaus, an alleged unknown early work of Jan Vermeer. Experts were thrilled. The most authoritative art critic of the time, Abraham Bredius, called the painting a Vermeer masterpiece. The Boymans Museum bought it for a fortune. Van Meegeren was ecstatic. He not only deceived the critics, but he made them worship his work. During World War II, he continued to find Vermeers. One of his best forgeries, Christ and the Sinner, He sold to Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man, in exchange for 137 genuine paintings from Dutch masters that the Nazis had looted from the Netherlands. After the war, Dutch authorities began investigating how national treasures had ended up with the Nazis. They traced it back to Van Meegeren and arrested him for collaboration, selling cultural artifacts to the enemy. This carried the death penalty. Van Meegeren found himself trapped. He could either die as a traitor or confess to being a brilliant forger. He chose the latter. "I did not sell a Vermeer to Göring," he declared in court. "I sold him my own painting. I tricked the fat pig." No one believed him. Judges, prosecutors, experts, they all laughed. "You cannot paint a Vermeer," they told him. "Give me the canvases and paints," replied Van Meegeren. "I will paint another one right here." Under guard in the courtroom, he painted his last forgery, young Christ preaching in the temple. Holland was in shock, then in amazement. A traitor became a national hero, a man who tricked even Hermann Göring into giving away a fortune for a fake. The accusations of collaboration were lifted. He was imprisoned for fraud and served only 1 year in prison, but he never completed his sentence, dying of a heart attack just 1 month after his conviction, becoming a legend. Van Meegeren deceived the world with his brush, but the hero of the next story cheated death using mathematics. He was a statistician who calculated how to survive a plane crash and fell from airplanes 7 times, but remained alive by following his own rules. Story number 13, the professor who figured out how not to die. Frane Selick was a music teacher from Croatia, but the world knows him as either the luckiest or the unluckiest person on the planet. His life is a series of disasters from which he emerged unscathed. The first time fate tested him was in 1962. The train he was on derailed and plunged into an icy river. 17 people drowned. Frane, breaking his arm, swam to shore. A year later, he was flying on a plane. The plane's door was ripped off and he was sucked out without a parachute. 19 people died. Frane landed in a haystack. 3 years later, the bus he was on fell off a bridge into a river. 4 people died. Frane swam to the shore with just a few scratches. The misfortunes kept coming. His car caught fire twice. The first time he managed to leap out just seconds before the gas tank exploded. The second time, flames burst from the ventilation and singed his hair, but he survived. He was hit by a bus and walked away with minor bruises. On a mountain road, he swerved away from a speeding truck. His car crashed through a guardrail and flew into a ravine. Frane didn't have time to jump out and grabbed a tree, watching as his car exploded 150 meters below. 7 times he faced death and 7 times he escaped. And the icing on the cake of his incredible life was the lottery. In 2003, at the age of 73, he bought a lottery ticket for the first time in his life and won $1 million. It seemed like a happy ending, but Frane, who had survived so much hardship, realized that money wasn't everything. He bought himself 2 houses and a boat while giving the rest of the money to friends and family. He said, "I don't need money. I only need my Katarina, my wife." He moved into a modest little house where he sang songs on his guitar until the end of his days, thanking either God or the devil. He never resolved the mystery of his incredible life. Frane thrived amidst chaos, but the hero of the next story, on the contrary, created chaos while trying to bring order. He was an urban planner who drew a straight line through the most populated city in the world, destroying thousands of homes to create the perfect street. And for that, he was cursed. Story number 14. The man who sliced through Paris. Paris in the mid-19th century was not the city we know today. It was a medieval labyrinth, with narrow, dark, filthy streets where cholera epidemics and revolutions broke out with regular frequency. It was easy to build barricades on these streets, and Parisians did so with impressive regularity. Emperor Napoleon I decided it was time to put an end to the old order. He needed a new Paris, bright, spacious, modern, and, importantly, convenient for artillery movement. The executor of his will was Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann, the prefect of the Seine department. Haussmann was not an architect. He was an administrator, a bulldozer in human form. He took a map of Paris and drew straight lines with a ruler, disregarding whatever lay in their path. This was the beginning of the Haussmannization of Paris. It was the most extensive and brutal reconstruction of the city in history. Haussmann demolished 19,000 buildings. Entire neighborhoods, where people had lived for centuries, were erased from the surface of the earth. 100,000 people were evicted from their homes. In place of winding streets, he carved out wide, straight boulevards. He constructed new bridges, parks, and a sewage system, which freed Paris from the plague. He created the very image of the city, with its famous six-story buildings and attics that we cherish today. However, the Parisians hated him. They called him a barbarian and a vandal. He was accused of destroying the soul of old Paris. Writers cursed him for tearing down the homes where heroes of novels once lived. Haussmann was unconcerned about feelings. He cared about efficiency. His boulevards were not only beautiful, they were strategically important. Barricades could not be built on them, and in the case of a riot, troops could quickly reach any point in the city. He worked for 17 years. In 1870, when the empire of Napoleon II fell, Haussmann was immediately dismissed. He died in poverty and obscurity, but the city he created remained. The paradox is that the man who was cursed as a destroyer is today regarded as the creator of modern Paris. We stroll along his boulevards, admiring their beauty, without thinking about how many tears and fates were buried beneath their cobblestones. Haussmann reshaped the city, but the hero of the next story reshaped time itself. He was a clockmaker who spent 40 years building a clock that never made mistakes and solved a problem that had baffled Newton and Galileo. For this, the Admiralty refused to pay him. Story number 15. The Clockmaker Who Conquered the Ocean. In the 15th century, the main problem of navigation was longitude. Sailors could determine latitude by the stars, but did not know how far east or west they had drifted. An error of 1 degree meant a deviation of 100 kilometers. Ships wrecked on rocks appearing out of nowhere, or they died of starvation without finding land. Thousands of lives were lost. The British government announced a reward of £20,000 sterling, which today amounts to millions of dollars, to anyone who could solve the problem of longitude. Scholars from the Royal Society, including Isaac Newton, were convinced that the answer lay among the stars. Accurate maps of lunar distances needed to be created. This was complicated, cumbersome, and required clear skies. But the solution came not from an observatory, but from a small workshop in London. It was discovered by John Harrison, a self-taught carpenter who became a brilliant clockmaker. Harrison realized that to know longitude, one needed to know the exact time. The Earth rotates at a speed of 15 degrees. If you know what time it is in Greenwich and can determine local time by the sun, the difference will indicate your longitude. The problem was that the clocks of that time were pendulum clocks. At sea, with the rolling motion, changes in temperature and humidity, they would lose minutes every day. What was needed was a chronometer that would not err by more than a couple of seconds over months of sailing. This seemed impossible. Harrison spent 40 years of his life creating the perfect marine chronometer. His first clock, H1, weighed 34 kilograms. This was a brass monster, with springs and balances that compensated for the rolling motion. They worked, but the Admiralty said, "Too complicated, too expensive." He built H2, then H3. Each model was better, more compact, and more precise. He invented the bimetallic strip, which is still used in thermostats, and ball bearings. He was 100 years ahead of the art of clockmaking, but the scientific council, composed of astronomers, sabotaged him. They did not want a carpenter without education to steal their glory and money. Finally, at the age of 68, he created his masterpiece, H4. These were large pocket watches with a diameter of 13 centimeters. In 1761, H4 was sent on a voyage to Jamaica. After 81 days at sea, it was only 5 seconds off. This was a victory, but the Admiralty refused to pay. They set new impossible demands. They made the old man dismantle the clock down to the last screw and copy it. Harrison battled bureaucracy for another 10 years. Only when he, in desperation, appealed directly to King George II did he intervene. "I swear to God, Harrison, you will get your money," exclaimed the king. At the age of 80, John Harrison finally received his reward. He died 3 years later, knowing that his stubbornness had saved countless sailors' lives. Harrison fought against time, but the hero of the next story fought against language. He was the man who single-handedly created the most popular artificial language in the world, hoping to unite humanity. But for this, he was pursued by both Hitler and Stalin. Story number 16. The Language of Hope. Ludwig Zamenhof grew up in the city of Bialystok, which was then part of the Russian Empire. It was Babylon. On the streets, people spoke Polish, Russian, Yiddish, German, and constantly fought. The Poles hated the Russians hated the Germans, and altogether, they hated the Jews. Little Ludwig, a Jewish boy, believed that the root of all this hatred was language. People did not understand each other, which is why they feared and hated one another. He decided to create a new language, a neutral, simple language that would belong to everyone and no one, a language that would serve as a bridge between nations. He began working on it at the age of 10. He spent all his youth working as an ophthalmologist by day and constructing his language at night. He took roots and elements from Germanic and Slavic languages. He created an extremely simple grammar, only 16 rules, no exceptions, no genders for nouns, one ending for all verbs. In 1887, he published the first textbook under the pseudonym Dr. Esperanto, Dr. Hopeful. The language was named after him. Esperanto became a sensation. The movement of the hopeful grew around the world. People saw in it not just a linguistic experiment, but a tool for achieving peace. Esperanto gave rise to poetry, translated the Bible, and hosted worldwide congresses. It seemed that the dream of Zamenhof was coming true. But then the 20th century arrived. The Nazis hated Esperanto. For them, it was the language of Jews and communists, a tool of a global conspiracy. Hitler mentioned it in Mein Kampf. In Germany, Esperantists were arrested, their clubs were shut down. 3 children of Zamenhof perished in the Holocaust. In the Soviet Union, Esperanto was initially encouraged, but then Stalin saw it as a threat. Esperantists communicate with foreigners, which means they are spies. Thousands of Soviet Esperantists were executed or sent to the Gulag. A language created for peace became a reason for persecution. Its creator, Ludwig, died in 1917 without witnessing how his brainchild fell under the crushing wheel of 2 of the most terrible dictatorships. But Esperanto survived. Today, it is spoken by an estimated 2 million people. It is the most successful artificial language in history, a living monument to a little boy from Bialystok who believed that the right words could stop bullets. Zamenhof created a language, but the hero of the next story created silence. He was a composer who wrote a piece consisting of 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, forcing the entire world to debate what music really is. Story number 17, The Sound of Silence. John Cage was an American avant-garde composer. He believed that music is not only harmony, but any sound around us. The noise of the street, the creak of a chair, a cough in the hall, all of this is part of the sound score of the world. In 1952, he decided to take this idea to its logical extreme. He wrote his most famous work, 433. The piece consists of 3 parts. The score has no notes. Instead, it has just one word, tacit, which means silence. The performer, usually a pianist, is to remain silent for a duration of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The premiere took place at a concert hall in Woodstock. Pianist David Tudor stepped onto the stage. He sat at the piano, lifted the lid, and did not touch the keys. The audience waited. A minute passed. Tudor closed the lid. End of the first part. Then he opened it again. Silence. 2 more minutes went by. He closed the lid. Opened it. A little over a minute remained. Closed it. Stood up and took a bow. The hall erupted. Part of the audience was furious. "This is a fraud! We have been cheated!" They shouted, stomped their feet, and walked out. Others were confused while some laughed. But Cage was serious. He said, "There is no such thing as silence." While I was writing this piece, I entered a soundproof room at Harvard, but I heard two sounds, a high one, which was my nervous system, and a low one, which was my blood. The music was not the notes that the pianist did not play. The music was the sounds produced by the hall itself. Coughing, creaking chairs, the wind outside, and dissatisfied murmurs. You, the audience, were the orchestra. 433 became the most scandalous and philosophical work of the 20th century. It is not a piece. It is a frame for a painting that life itself paints. Cage made people listen to silence and understand that it is filled with sounds. This piece is a challenge, a meditation, a joke. It is still performed all over the world and sounds different every time because each hall and each moment are unique. Cage found music in silence, but the heroine of the next story found light in darkness. She was a blind and deaf girl who was considered a wild animal, but she learned to speak, graduated from Harvard, and became one of the greatest humanists of the century. This is story number 18, Awakening in the Darkness. Helen Keller was born a healthy child, but at 19 months she fell ill, likely from scarlet fever or meningitis, and lost her sight and hearing. She found herself trapped in complete darkness and silence. She could not communicate. She did not know what words were or what the world around her was like. She was like a small wild animal, expressing her desires through screams and tantrums. Her parents were desperate. Doctors advised them to send her to an asylum for the mentally ill. But they found one last hope, a 20-year-old teacher named Anne Sullivan. Anne was almost blind herself and had grown up in an institution. She understood what isolation meant. She arrived at the Keller home and began a battle for the mind of the little girl. She tried to teach Helen words by tracing letters on her palm. She gave her a doll and wrote D-O-L-L on her hand. Helen mimicked the motion but did not understand the connection. For her, it was just a game. The breakthrough happened at the water pump. Anne took Helen to the pump. She placed one of the girl's hands under the cold water stream and persistently spelled out W-A-T-E-R again and again. And suddenly, Helen froze. A light flashed in her brain. She understood that this cold, wet thing flowing over her hand and these signs meant the same thing. Everything in the world has a name. She began to run around the yard, touching the ground, grass, and fence, demanding that Anne name everything for her. That day she learned 30 words. Her mind awakened. The prison crumbled. What followed was a miracle. Helen learned to read using Braille, to type on a special typewriter. She learned to hear by placing her fingers on the lips and throat of the speaker. She even learned to speak, though her voice always remained rough and difficult to understand. She enrolled in Radcliffe College, the women's counterpart of Harvard. Anne Sullivan sat beside her in all her lectures, translating the professor's words onto her palm. In 1904, Helen Keller graduated from college with honors. She became a world-renowned writer, lecturer, and activist. She fought for women's rights and the rights of people with disabilities. She met with 12 presidents of the United States. She traveled the world. The woman who lived in a world without sounds and light saw and heard more than most sighted and hearing people. Helen learned to speak, but the hero of the next story, on the contrary, remained silent. He was the most famous mime in the world, who saved hundreds of Jewish children from the Nazis, using his art to teach them the most important lesson: silence. This is story number 19, The Mime Who Taught Children to Be Silent. Marcel Mangel grew up in Strasbourg on the border of France and Germany. He was a Jewish boy who adored Charlie Chaplin. He dreamed of becoming a mime. But in 1940, the Nazis invaded his dreams. His father was deported to Sfinsim and died there. 16-year-old Marcel and his brother Alan went to join the French resistance. Marcel took the pseudonym Marceau in honor of a general from the French Revolution. His main weapon was not a rifle, but his talent. Marceau worked with an organization that saved orphaned Jewish children. They hid them in shelters and then secretly smuggled them across the border to neutral Switzerland. But how do you lead a group of frightened, crying children through a forest past German patrols? Any sound could cost them their lives. This is where Marcel Marceau used his artistry. He played with them. He created funny characters, walked a tightrope, and fought against the wind. He charmed the children. They laughed, but they laughed quietly. He taught them to be silent not through orders, but through play. He showed them that silence was part of the performance, part of the adventure. During one of the crossings over the Alps, he led a group of 24 children. They stumbled upon a German patrol. The soldiers could have shot them all, but Marceau began to improvise. He put on an entire show, distracting the Germans while the children hid in the bushes. The Germans, thinking he was just a wandering artist, laughed and moved on. He made 3 such journeys, saving hundreds of lives. He said, "My best performance was not on stage, it was in the forest." After the liberation of Paris, he gave his first big concert in front of 3,000 American soldiers. He silently showed them all the horrors of war: fear, struggle, hope. The soldiers cried. After the war, Marcel Marceau created his famous character, the clown Bip, with a white face and a flower on his hat. He became the most famous mime in the world. Millions admired his artistry. But few knew that behind the sad smile of the clown was the story of a boy who saved children by teaching them to play in silence. Marceau saved children with silence, but the hero of the next story saved a city with noise, or rather, with a sound that was missing. He was a sound engineer who created the most famous sound effect in cinematic history, one you have heard thousands of times, but do not know its name. Story number 20. The scream you have heard 1,000 times. If you watched Star Wars, Indiana Jones, The Lord of the Rings, or almost any other action movie made in the last 50 years, you have heard it. It's a short, piercing scream made by a character when they fall from a height, get shot, or are eaten by a dinosaur. This sound is called the Wilhelm scream. Its story began in 1951, during the filming of the Western film Distant Drums. In one scene, a soldier walking through a swamp is bitten and dragged underwater by an alligator. The director requested a realistic scream of terror. 6 takes were recorded. The 5th take, performed by actor Sheb Wooley, was perfect. A piercing, desperate, slightly comical shriek. The recording of that sound ended up in the Warner Brothers studio archive. 2 years later, in the Western film Attack at River Feather, one of the characters, Private Wilhelm, gets shot in the leg by an arrow. Sound designer Ben Burt, searching for a suitable sound, stumbled upon that very recording. He used the 5th take. So, Wilhelm's scream got a name. And this is where an inside joke began. Ben Burt and his fellow sound engineers started inserting the Wilhelm scream into every film they worked on. It became their secret sign, an Easter egg. When Burt was working on Star Wars, he included the scream in the scene where a stormtrooper falls into a chasm on the Death Star. When he worked on Indiana Jones, he used it when a Nazi falls from a truck. The joke spiraled out of control. Other sound engineers picked it up. The Wilhelm scream became a meme of tradition. Quentin Tarantino, Peter Jackson, Steven Spielberg, all of them used it. It's in Transformers, Toy Story, and Beauty and the Beast. This sound became the most famous sound cliché in film history. It has been heard in more than 400 films. We hear it, but we don't realize that it's the same scream recorded 70 years ago for a film that no one remembers. It's a ghost from the audio archive, living its own life, dying over and over on screen for our entertainment. The Wilhelm scream has become immortal. But the hero of the next story sought immortality and found death in a cauldron of molten metal. He was the first emperor of China, who built the Great Wall and the Terracotta Army, but died after drinking a life elixir made from mercury. Story number 21. The Emperor Who Was Killed by Immortality. Qin Shi Huang was the man who created China. He unified warring kingdoms, standardized writing, currency, and measures of weight. He built the Great Wall of China to protect himself from barbarians. He was a genius, a tyrant, and a paranoid. But more than anything in the world, he feared death. Unifying the Middle Kingdom, he set a new goal: to conquer time. He sent expeditions in search of mythical islands of the immortals, where, according to legend, grew fruits that grant eternal life. The ships sailed and did not return. Then he turned to alchemists. Court magicians and charlatans promised him the elixir of life. They claimed they had found the secret formula. The main ingredient was mercury. In ancient Chinese medicine, liquid silver was believed to have magical properties capable of extending life. The emperor began taking mercury pills every day. He believed they made him invulnerable. In reality, they were slowly killing him. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It destroys the brain and nervous system. The emperor's behavior became increasingly strange. He suffered from outbursts of rage, paranoia, and hallucinations. He ordered the burning of all historical books so that history would start with him. He executed hundreds of scholars, burying them alive. He prepared for death. Even as he sought immortality, he built himself a grand tomb, a whole underground palace. To guard it, he ordered the creation of a terracotta army, 8,000 life-sized clay warriors with horses and chariots. Each warrior had a unique face. According to historian Sima Qian, the tomb contained rivers of mercury, imitating the Yangtze and the Yellow River, while the ceiling was adorned with pearls representing stars. In the year 210 before our era, during a journey across the country, the 49-year-old emperor died, most likely from mercury poisoning. His advisors, fearing a rebellion, concealed his death. They transported his body in a closed carriage for another 2 months. To mask the smell of decay, they ordered a cart of salted fish to follow behind. Qin Shi Huangdi, a man who sought eternal life, perished from his own medicine, and his body traveled the land alongside rotten fish. The emperor searched for life in poison, but the hero of the next story found poison in wallpaper. He was the greatest conqueror in history, who died in exile on a tiny island. Only 200 years later did scholars understand that he was not killed by cancer, but by the color of his bedroom. Story number 22. Napoleon's Green Wallpaper. In the year 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte, once the master of Europe, died on the island of St. Helena. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, but rumors of poisoning had circulated from the very beginning. The primary suspect was the British governor who held Napoleon captive. The mystery remained unsolved for nearly 200 years. In the late 20th century, scholars gained access to strands of Napoleon's hair that were cut after his death. Analysis revealed shocking results. The hair contained a massive dose of arsenic, 40 times the normal limit. This was proof of poisoning. But who was the murderer? Swedish scientist Sten Forshed began his own investigation. He studied the diaries of Napoleon's servants, his symptoms, daily routine, but he could not find the answer. Then he stumbled upon a description of the house where Napoleon lived. Longwood House was a damp, decaying building, and the walls in the emperor's favorite room, his bathroom where he spent hours, were covered in bright green wallpaper. For Forshed, this was the key. In the 19th century, the most fashionable color was green shades, a bright emerald hue. It was made using a pigment that contained copper acetate and arsenic trioxide. This color was everywhere, in clothing, in paints, in artificial flowers, and of course, in wallpaper. No one knew that this beauty was a slow killer. In the damp climate of St. Helena, mold grew on the wallpaper. The fungus, consuming the glue, reacted chemically with the pigment and released the poisonous gas trimethylarsine into the air. Napoleon breathed arsenic for years. Every day during his baths, he inhaled the poison that evaporated from his beloved green walls. This explained all his symptoms: nausea, abdominal pain, hair loss. It was not a quick death from poison in wine, but a slow, agonizing poisoning by his own home. The murderer of Napoleon was not a British spy. The killer was fashion. The color killed Napoleon, but the hero of the next story, on the contrary, survived thanks to color. He was an artist who ended up in a gulag and survived by painting portraits of Stalin on tissue paper. Story number 23. The Portrait of the Leader as Salvation. Mikhail Sokolov was an artist of the Silver Age, a friend of Akhmatova and Mandelstam. His style, expressive and nervous, far from socialist realism, was labeled formalism. In the year 1938, he was arrested. He was tortured, forced to confess to espionage. He did not confess. He was sentenced to 7 years in the camps and sent to the Taiga station in Siberia. For an artist used to the comfortable life of Leningrad, the camp was hell. Hunger, cold, scurvy, exhausting work and logging. People died by the hundreds. Sokolov, an intellectual in glasses, was supposed to perish first, but art saved him. The camp commander, upon learning that Sokolov was an artist, summoned him. He wanted a portrait of Stalin, but there was neither canvas nor paint in the camp. Sokolov was given a piece of plywood and whatever they could find, soot, brick dust, laundry bluing. Instead of brushes, he used splinters and his own fingers. He painted the portrait. The commander liked it. Art became his second profession, his armor. While others were felling trees, Sokolov was painting. He created portraits of the camp authorities, their wives, and children. He painted slogans like, "Thank you, Comrade Stalin, for our happy childhood." But even in this role, he remained an artist. At night in the barracks, he painted for himself. On tiny scraps of cigarette paper, using charcoal from the stove or a broken piece of a pencil, he created his own world. He painted landscapes from memory, Venice, Paris. He painted Don Quixote battling the camp watchtowers. He painted the gaunt faces of his comrades. Unfortunately, these tiny drawings the size of a postage stamp were acts of resistance. He hid them in his sleeve or sewed them into the lining of his coat. Mikhail Sokolov survived. He was released in 1943. He returned to Moscow but was broken. He was banned from exhibiting his work. He died in poverty, in a small room in a communal apartment. Only after his death, when his miniature works were discovered, did the world see the true scale of his talent. The artist whom the system tried to crush preserved his soul on scraps of paper, proving that art can survive even where human life perishes. Sokolov survived thanks to a portrait of a tyrant. But the hero of the next story, on the contrary, perished because of a portrait of his wife. He was a scientist who discovered X-rays but refused to patent them, believing they should belong to all humanity, and died of cancer caused by his own invention. This is story number 24. The man who saw the bones of his wife. Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. In 1995, he was conducting experiments with cathode rays in his laboratory. One evening, he noticed a strange glow. A screen made of barium placed at the other end of the room began to glow, even though the cathode tube was covered with black cardboard. Röntgen realized he had discovered a new, invisible type of radiation. He named it X-rays. He locked himself in the laboratory for 6 weeks. He didn't sleep and barely ate. He placed various objects in the path of the rays, a book, and he could see a lead bookmark inside, a wooden box, and he could see the nails. On December 22nd, he called his wife Anna Bertha to the laboratory. He asked her to place her hand on the photographic plate and directed the rays at her. When he developed the image, they were both horrified. The photograph revealed the bones of her hand and the wedding ring hanging on the finger bone like a ghost. "I saw my own death," Anna Bertha said. This was the first X-ray image of a human in history. The discovery created a sensation. The world went crazy. Newspapers reported on rays that could see through clothing. Enterprising entrepreneurs began to sell X-ray-proof underwear. Doctors immediately started using the rays to diagnose fractures. Röntgen was offered a patent for his invention, which would have made him a multi-millionaire, but he refused. "My discovery belongs to all of humanity," he said. He took not a cent for the use of his technology. In 1901, he received the first Nobel Prize in Physics ever awarded. He donated the money to his university. But there was a dark side. No one knew radiation was dangerous. Röntgen and other pioneers of radiology worked without any protection. They placed their hands under the rays to adjust the apparatus. Many of them developed cancer. Their fingers became covered in sores, their skin peeled away, and they died in agony. Röntgen himself died in 1923 from intestinal cancer. It was likely related to his work. He gave humanity a tool that saved millions of lives, but he paid for it with his own. Röntgen saw what was hidden, but the hero of the next story, on the contrary, showed everyone what was right in front of their eyes, but no one noticed. He was a photographer who captured motion, slicing seconds into frames, and decided to settle a debate on whether a horse lifts all four legs off the ground while galloping. Story number 25. The debate over the flying horse. In the 19th century, artists depicted galloping horses in a swallow-like pose. The front legs were extended forward, and the hind legs were back. It looked beautiful and heroic. But does a horse really run that way? That question troubled Leland Stanford, a former governor of California, a railroad magnate, and a passionate horse racing fan. He made a wager with his friend for $25,000. A huge sum for those times, over whether at some point in a gallop all four legs of a horse leave the ground simultaneously. But how could he prove it? The human eye could not capture such fast movement. Stanford hired Edward Muybridge, an eccentric English photographer. Muybridge was known for his landscapes, as well as for killing his wife's lover and being acquitted by a jury who deemed it justifiable homicide. The task seemed impossible. Cameras of the time required long exposure times. Muybridge spent 5 years and a fortune of Stanford's. He transformed the racetrack into a laboratory. Along the track, he set up 24 cameras. He attached a thread to the shutter of each camera, stretched across the track. When the horse ran by, it broke the threads one by one, and the cameras clicked. In 1878, the experiment succeeded. Muybridge captured a series of photographs that broke down the horse's movement into phases, and he proved that Stanford was right. The horse truly does lift all four legs off the ground. But even this was shocking to all. It does not do so in the swallow pose. It does so at the moment when all four legs are tucked under its belly. The swallow pose was a fabrication of artists, but Muybridge went further. He invented the zoopraxiscope, a device that projected his images onto a screen in rapid succession. When he turned the knob, the horse on the screen ran. This marked the birth of cinematography, a decade before the Lumiere brothers. Edward Muybridge, trying to settle a debate about horses, accidentally invented cinema. He revealed to the world what lies hidden between moments, forever changing our perception of reality. Muybridge paused a moment, but the hero of the next story, on the contrary, sought to accelerate it. He was a mathematician who predicted the existence of a planet using only a pen and paper. Yet his discovery was stolen because he was too young and modest. Story number 26. A planet found at the tip of a pen. In 1843, the astronomical world was in turmoil. The planet Uranus was behaving strangely. It moved through its orbit in ways that did not conform to Newton's laws. It would speed up and then slow down. There was only one explanation. There was another invisible planet beyond Uranus that was tugging on it with its gravity. Finding this planet X became the main scientific race of the century. John Couch Adams was a 24-year-old mathematics student from Cambridge. He was a genius, but very humble and shy. He set out to calculate the position of the unknown planet. For 2 years, he pored over papers, scribbling hundreds of pages of complex equations. He took into account the gravity of the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. This was a titanic task, one that today is performed by supercomputers. In September 1845, Adams achieved a breakthrough. He calculated the mass, orbit, and precise position of planet X in the sky. He sent his calculations to George Airy, the royal astronomer at the Greenwich Observatory. However, Airy was a pompous snob. He did not believe that some upstart student could solve astronomy's greatest mystery. He pushed Adams's papers aside and forgot about them. At the same time, in France, the same problem was being solved by Urbain Le Verrier, a respected and well-known mathematician. He was unaware of Adams's work. He also spent months calculating and arrived at almost the same result. Le Verrier sent his data to the Berlin Observatory astronomer Johann Galle. He wrote, "Aim your telescope at this point, and you will find the planet." On the night of September 23, 1846, Galle did just that, and within 1 degree of the predicted point, he saw a small blue star that was not on any maps. It was Neptune. An international scandal erupted. The English shouted that the French had stolen their discovery. The French accused the English of fraud. Only when Adams's notes were published did it become clear that he had found Neptune a year earlier. However, due to bureaucracy and nepotism, his discovery was buried. In the end, the fame of the discoverers was shared by both Adams and Leverrier. Adams held no grudge. He was too absorbed in science. But his story is a lesson about how genius without audacity often remains in the shadows. Adams found a planet, but the hero of the next story found a virus. Not just any virus, but one that kills bacteria. It could have saved the world from antibiotic resistance, but his discoveries were ignored because he was too strange and hot-tempered a Canadian. Story number 27. The Enemy of My Enemy. Felix Drell was a self-taught Canadian microbiologist. He did not have a university diploma. He learned while working as a lab technician. He was brilliant, but unbearable. Hot-tempered, arrogant, he constantly clashed with his superiors. In 1917, during World War I, he worked at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. He was asked to investigate an outbreak of dysentery among soldiers. Drell collected samples from the sick, grew dysentery bacteria in petri dishes, and he noticed something strange. Occasionally, on a solid carpet of bacteria, there would appear small, perfectly round patches where all the bacteria were dead. At first, he thought it was a defect, but the patches kept returning. Drell hypothesized there was an invisible killer, something that hunted the bacteria. He took liquid from one of those patches, filtered it to remove the bacteria, and added a drop of this clear liquid to a new colony. The next morning, the entire colony was dead. Drell realized he had discovered a virus that infects and kills bacteria. He named it bacteriophage, meaning bacteria eater. This was a revolutionary discovery. If there was a virus that killed dysentery bacteria, then there must be others that kill cholera, plague, and staphylococcus bacteria. This was a weapon against any infection. Drell began to treat people. He gave patients with dysentery a cocktail of phages, and they recovered in just one day. He halted a cholera epidemic in India by treating wells with phages. He treated the plague in Egypt. It seemed like the panacea had arrived, but the scientific community did not accept him. First of all, phages were unpredictable. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they did not. Secondly, Drell was a self-taught man with a terrible temper. His ideas were dismissed as quackery. Then Fleming discovered penicillin. Antibiotics were simpler, more reliable, and could generate profit. Phages were forgotten for 50 years. Only in the Soviet Union, especially in Georgia, did phage therapy continue to develop. Today, as the world faces the problem of superbugs resistant to all antibiotics, scientists have once again remembered the hot-tempered Canadian and his eaters of bacteria. Phage therapy is experiencing a revival. A discovery made 100 years ago may become our main weapon in the future. Drell found the invisible killer, but the hero of the next story, on the contrary, was searching for invisible life. He was a fabric merchant who, in his spare time, polished lenses and was the first person to see the world of microbes, calling them little beasts. Story number 28. The Merchant Who Discovered the Invisible Universe. Antony van Leeuwenhoek was not a scientist. He was a Dutch fabric merchant in the city of Delft in the 17th century. His job was to count the threads in fabric, determining its quality. For this, he used magnifying glasses. But the microscopes available for sale were of poor quality. Leeuwenhoek, a man with golden hands and endless curiosity, began to make his own. He learned to polish tiny lenses the size of a pinhead. He mastered this skill to such an extent that his microscopes magnified 270 times, 10 times more powerful than any scientific instrument of his time. And he began to observe everything. He looked at the sting of a bee, the eye of a fly, the scales of a fish. But one day, he decided to take a look at a drop of rainwater from a barrel. What he saw astonished him. In the drop of water, which turned out to be absolutely clean, life was teeming. Thousands of tiny creatures swam back and forth. They tumbled, floated, and jostled each other. He called them animalcules. Little beasts. Leeuwenhoek became a colossus of the microscopic world. He was the first person to see bacteria, protozoa, and spermatozoa. He studied his own semen, blood cells. He began writing letters to the Royal Society in London, the most prestigious scientific academy in the world. In his letters written in simple Dutch, he described his discoveries with childlike enthusiasm. The learned men in London initially laughed. A fabric merchant seeing little beasts in water? Nonsense. They thought he was mad or a fraud. But Leeuwenhoek was persistent. He sent so many detailed descriptions and drawings that the scientists were compelled to investigate. They built their own microscopes and, to their astonishment, saw the same things. Leeuwenhoek became a celebrity. Kings and emperors traveled to Delft to look through his magical lenses, including Peter I. He made more than 500 microscopes, but never revealed the secret of his lenses to anyone. He took it with him to the grave. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, an uneducated merchant, independently discovered a new, invisible universe that lives parallel to ours and laid the foundations of microbiology. Leeuwenhoek saw small life, but the hero of the next story witnessed great death. He was a priest who kept a diary during the siege of his town during the 30 Years' War, and his records are all that remain of a whole world turned to ash. Story number 29. The Diary of the End of the World. The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, was one of the most brutal in European history. It was a meat grinder where religion, politics, and greed mixed into a bloody cocktail. Germany lost 1/3 of its population. Whole regions were turned into scorched deserts. But we know about the horrors of this war not just from the dry reports of generals. We know of them thanks to the diary of a village priest from Bavaria named Gans Heuser. His village, Diesen, found itself on the path of the army. Swedes, Spaniards, French, and imperial soldiers marched through. Each army brought with it plunder, violence, and plague. Gans Heuser kept a diary. He recorded everything. He described not the great battles, but the small tragedies. How soldiers drove his family from their home and turned it into a stable. How his neighbors were tortured to give up their non-existent savings. How his daughter died of the plague in his arms. He wrote of the hunger that was worse than soldiers. Today we ate soup made of nettles and herbs, he wrote. Children cry, but there is no bread. A neighbor slaughtered his last cat. He described the collapse of humanity, how people stopped burying the dead, how brother turned against brother for a piece of bread. But his diary is not only a chronicle of horror, it is also a story of resilience. He recorded how they hid grain in the forest, how women protected each other from rapists, and how they continued to pray in the ruined church. The most poignant entry was made after another raid. They took everything, but they could not take the sunrise. It is still beautiful. Hans Heuser survived the war. He died in old age, having lived to see peace. His diary, which he called The Diary, was found in the archives of the monastery only in the 19th century. This is not a historical document. It is a cry of the soul. The voice of a little man lost in a grand history, proving that even when the world is crumbling, one can preserve the light within by simply recording the truth. Heuser kept the past, but the heroine of the next story, on the contrary, tried to erase it. She was a woman who married the Eiffel Tower and fought for the right of people to love inanimate objects. No, that's too strange. Let's go for something more down to earth. The heroine of our final story was a woman who became the most successful sharpshooter in history, not in war, but at a fair. She defeated all the men, became the star of Buffalo Bill's show, and taught the world that a woman could shoot better than any cowboy. This is Annie Oakley. Story number 30. A Little Faithful Hand. Cincinnati, Ohio. Thanksgiving, 1875. The famous traveling shooter Frank Butler arrived in town. He was a star, a showman. He announced a bet, $100 to any local who could beat him at shooting clay pigeons. Butler was unbeatable, and he knew it. The owner of a local hotel where Butler was staying accepted the challenge. "I have a shooter," he said. On the designated day, a crowd gathered at the shooting range. Frank Butler, a tall and confident man, took his position. He waited for his opponent. And then, from the crowd, came a small, skinny teenage girl. She was only 15 years old. Her name was Annie Mosey, but the world would remember her by another name. She wore a simple homespun dress and held an old rifle that belonged to her father. The crowd snickered, then laughed. Butler smiled. Is this a joke? It was not a joke. They began to shoot. 25 shots. Butler was flawless, as always. He hit again and again. But the girl did not miss either. Her movements were calm and precise. She did not aim. She simply raised her rifle and shot, as if it were an extension of her arm. On the 25th shot, Frank Butler's nerves faltered. He missed. Annie hit all 25. The 15-year-old girl from the backwoods defeated the best shooter in America. But this story is not about the victory. It's about what happened next. Frank Butler did not get angry. He fell in love. He was so impressed by her talent and humility that a year later they married. And he did the unthinkable for a man of that era. He stepped into the shadows. He became her assistant and manager. She became a star. Annie Oakley. She joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and became a global sensation. What she could do with a rifle seemed like magic. She could knock off the ash from a cigarette held between her husband's teeth. She could hit the edge of a playing card thrown into the air and cut it in half. She shot while glancing in a mirror over her shoulder. She tossed 10 glass marbles into the air and managed to break them all before they touched the ground. The Indian chief, Sitting Bull, was so impressed by her performance that he adopted her and named her Watanya Cecilia, Little Sure Shot. Once in Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II asked her to perform a cigarette trick on him. He held a cigarette between his teeth. Annie calmly knocked off the ash with a shot. Many years later, when World War I began, she joked, "If I shot better, perhaps we could have avoided this war." Annie Oakley was more than just a circus performer. She was a symbol. She proved that a woman could be stronger, more accurate, and braver than any man. She taught 15,000 women how to shoot. The 4th volume is closed. We have seen how one person's mistake changes the planet's climate, how silence saves lives, and how the truth can kill. We have witnessed brilliant discoveries languish in archives while crazy ideas change the world. These stories are not fiction. They are proof that the human spirit, will, and even foolishness are the most powerful forces in the universe. They bend reality, break the laws, and write chronicles that are hard to believe. But remember, the most incredible story might begin tomorrow with you.